So let's start by looking at a pretty straightforward function. So we'll take two positional parameters and then we'll scoop up any extra ones. And all we're going to do here is just print out the parameters values. Okay, so now we can of course call this function passing in two parameters for a and b, let's say 1 and 2, and then we can pass a few others, and I'll use strings just to differentiate. So when we do that, we see that a got 1, b got 2, and then args got the x, y, z parameters, and that became a tuple. So that works just fine, but there is a little catch here. There's certain things that you can't do. You cannot start using keyword arguments to pass in a and b and still use the star args. In other words, you can't do something like this. Let's say a equals 1, b equals 2, and then x, y, and z. The reason for that is because, as you know, if you remember from one of our earlier videos, once you start using keyword arguments when you're calling a function, you can't revert to positional arguments. But these x, y, z arguments are actually positional arguments. So if you try and do that, you'll get a syntax error, right? That's going to be incorrect. Now, the same thing happens also if you try and do something like this. Let's say we have a, let's say we put a default value, b equals 2, and then star args. And then let's say we have c equals 3. Let's put in 3. And then here we'll just print a, b, c, and args. Okay. So again, we can just call this function passing in 1, 2, 3, and then let's say x, y, and z for the star args. And that works as expected, right? A was 1, b was 2, c was 3. If we had changed that to, let's say, something else, maybe 4, then of course b becomes 4. But now what happens if I want to use the default value for b? So I want to do maybe something like this, func a. Now I want to skip b, so the only way I can skip b is to specify c maybe. So maybe I'll say c equals 5. And then I want to put the additional positional parameters. Well, I can't, right? For the same reason. So once I set c equal 5 because I wanted to skip b because I wanted to use its default value, then I couldn't do it, right? Again, well, I can't use a, sorry. Let's pass in a value. Okay, so I have nothing in the star args. Now, if I wanted to put something in the star args, the only way to do it is to pass it as these extra positionals. But that doesn't work again because we're trying to specify a positional argument after we started using a keyword argument. So that doesn't work either. So be careful. The thing is, when you start putting in default values for positionals and you have a star args, then you kind of basically lose the ability to use the default values. All right, so now let's look at this example here. Func a, let's say b equals 2, so I'll put in a default value and I'll put in the star args, which again, as we know, is really going to stop us from using b, b's default. And then we'll take a keyword now, and then we'll set it to a default, and then d. Okay, so we have these, oops. And we're just going to print a, b, we'll print args, and then c and d, which are our keyword-only arguments. So we can call this function using something like func, let's say 10, 20. We'll put in a few extra arguments, x, y, and z. And then we'll specify, now we have to use keyword arguments. So we'll do c equals 4 and d equals 1. So that works perfectly fine. We can also, if we want, do this, 10, 20, x, y, z, and then we're going to skip defining c because it has a default, so it's an optional, and then we'll say d equals maybe 10. And of course we get what we expect, so that works properly. But what happens if I want to do the following? Let's say func 1, I want to use the default for b, so I'm going to skip b, right? I'm going to say x, y, z, and now I'm going to go back and maybe define b. b equals 4, right? C I don't have to define, so I'll skip it, and d equals 10. Well, the problem here look at the error that we get. We got that func got multiple values for argument b. Well, if you think about what's going on here we have 4 positional arguments. And here we're saying we need 2 and then the remaining ones. Well, what happened in fact is that A got 1, B got X. And so we've already actually assigned a value to B. Because Python doesn't know that we're trying to skip B here. Even though we've got B as a keyword argument here, it doesn't know that. So it puts X into B and then Y and Z into args. So in fact, you'll see what happens. And of course, you can't, pass the same argument twice. So if I remove this B equals 4, then you'll see in fact what happened, right? A got 1, B got X, and then args got Y and Z, and then C defaulted to 3, and D was now 10. All right, so just a few caveats when you're using combinations of, positionals with default values and the star args. You got to be a little careful because certain things don't always work quite as expected. All right, the next thing I want to look at is maybe just do a full function. So let's go ahead and say def func. We'll say a, comma b, comma star args, comma c equals 10, comma d equals 20, comma star star kw args. And then here we're just going to print everything. A, b, args, c, d, and kw args. Okay. So now, of course, we can call this function this way. We can pass 2 values. That will be a and b. So let's do 1 and 2. Then we have the args themselves, which is x, y, z. Then we have c and d. Now, c and d have to be passed as keyword. And they both have default, so I actually don't have to specify any of them. But I will in this case. I'll say c equals 100, d equals 200. And then we can pass in some extra keyword arguments as well. Maybe we'll say x equals 0.1 and y equals 0.2. All right, let's leave it at that. And then, of course, what we get is a was 1, b was 2. The remaining positionals go into args. C and D were assigned 100 and 200 respectively. And then the remaining keyword arguments go into the quargs. All right, so that's just how it works. Now, one thing I want to look at is some examples of functions that actually use this kind of stuff and how it uses it, and where this, especially these keyword arguments can really become useful, as well as the star args. So a very simple example, one that we use all the time, is print. So if we look at print, and we saw that in the lecture slides. Now the help here doesn't actually write it out as star objects. It just says value, comma, dot, dot, dot. But what it means is that they've got a star args in there, right? They've got a star, and in the documentation they call it star objects, where objects is the name of the variable, but it's just star args. It's the same thing. So it's something that's scooping up all your positional parameters. And then, of course, after that, we now have keyword arguments, and they're keyword only arguments, and they all have a default. So here's what happens. When we say print 1, 2, 3, then in fact what's happening is that it's collecting the positionals, right? Using this star that's in the first parameter of the print function. So it prints out 1 space 2 space 3 new line, right? If I was to print, let's say here 4, 5, 6 as well, you'll notice that there's a new line after the 3. Because we're starting on the next line when the print statement runs again. And that comes from these keyword parameters that all have default values. And you can see that here we have sep, which is the separator, which is a default of a space. That's what gets printed between the characters. So if I was to do something like this, print 1, 2, 3, and then sep equals, and I'll change the separator to maybe a dash, right? And then I'll print again 4, 5, 6. And again, we'll change the separator and make it a dash. So as you can see, what we've done here when we called print, we passed in 3 positionals, and then we put in the keyword only argument. So we put sep equal to dash, and so we get a dash now in between. And of course, the same thing, if you want to change your new line, well, all you have to say is end equals \n will be a new line, right? That's what comes at the end. Now, I don't have to put a new line. I could just put, let's say, a space, star, 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 space. And let's see what happens when I do that. Well, you can see that 1, 2, 3 with dashes, then we have the space, 3 stars of space, and then the 4, 5, 6 with dashes in between. So this is kind of a typical usage of keyword arguments. Very often that's how functions work. They have their kind of default, positional parameters. And then if you want to modify the behavior of the function, you can do so, and then you use these keyword-only arguments. So that's kind of a neat way of setting up your functions. So let's look at an example that we might build ourselves. Let's say we do this calc high-low average that we looked at in the lecture. So the first thing is I'm going to want to collect as many positional parameters as are being used in the call to this function. And then we're also going to do now a keyword-only parameter, right? Because it comes out to the star args, so the positional parameters have been exhausted. And we'll make that default to false. And then here I'm going to say high equals, well, technically the high would be the max of the args, right? But the problem is that args could be empty, right? Star args doesn't require a parameter. So I'm going to allow people to send, no values, no arguments for these positionals, in which case I want the high, the low, and the average to be 0. So how would I do that? Well, if it's a tuple, if the tuple is empty, it's going to be falsy, right? So I could say something like args and. But of course, I want high to be a number. So I want to convert this args here to the number 0, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a Boolean, and then I'm going to convert it to an int. So first I'm going to explicitly set it to a Boolean, then make it an int. Because I can't just convert a tuple to an int. I first need to take the truth value, the associated truth value of args explicitly. So for that, I need to convert it to a bool, right? Remember, when I do bool, it's just going to basically extract the truth value of args, which if it's empty is going to be 0. Well, it's going to be false, right? And then I'm going to convert that explicitly to a 0, to an integer 0. And so if the integer is 0, then high will be 0. And the only way that's going to be 0 is if args is empty. Otherwise, it's going to return the max of the values inside this args tuple. So this is now combining a few things from a few videos back of, when we looked at Booleans and how the AND operator works and how we can use that to, short circuit with the evaluations. And then low, we're going to do exactly the same thing. So we're going to take int of bool. Now, okay, let me write int a little differently. I'm going to write int using the if statement, the way you might, do it, not using this short-circuited thing. So I might say if args, now you might actually even do this, if the length of args is equal to 0, then set the low equal to 0, else set the low equal to the min now of the args, okay? So this will work as well. This is kind of equivalent to what I wrote over here. So this is just a simpler syntax, maybe a little harder to read when you're not used to it. But if you get used to it, then, this kind of makes sense quite easily. This, of course, is a lot more explicit, right? You can even use the ternary operator if you want for this one here, in which case you might do something like this. You might say low is equal to the min of args if len of args is greater than 0, else 0. Right? You can also write it this way instead of using the if-else statement. You can just use that ternary operator. All right, so I'll leave it at that. And then average, now in this case, is going to be equal to high plus low divided by 2. And we want to return the average, right? That's what our function does. However, now we're going to use this keyword only to also log it to the console if we are requested to do so, if this is true. So we're going to say if log to console, then I'm just going to print, and here we'll say that the high is equal to this, the low is equal to the low, and the average is equal to the average. This will be the number 1 index, the 2 index, and then we'll format this, passing in high, low, and average. Okay, so that's our function. So now we can say, you know, average equals calc high, low, average. And I'm going to average out, and, you know, let's pass 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, the low is 1, the high is 5. So the average is going to be 5 plus 1 divided by 2 is going to be 3. Okay. And I'm going to not specify log to console, which means it's going to default to false. So when I do that, and I can print the average out just to see that we got at least the correct results. There we go, 3.0. But of course, I might be running the program and say, well, you know what? As I'm debugging, maybe I'm going to say log to console equals, and maybe you hard code it here, or maybe you have, you know, an is debug flag, and let's say the debug flag is true. So you just set it here to is debug. And so now, you know, you can set that in your module or wherever, and then when your program is running, it's going to log it to the console as it runs. And so when we do that, we can see that now it logged. So again, this is just an example of, you know, how sometimes keyword-only arguments are used to modify the behavior of the function. Sometimes also what happens is that you just have too many parameters in this, you know, in this function call. And maybe you've got 5, 6, 7 parameters, and, you know, it can be really a problem if you specify the values in the wrong order. You got to remember every time what's the order of the parameters. So in that case, you may very well decide to build a function like this, where you say def func, and then you immediately start and you say, okay, I'm only going to take in keyword only arguments, right? That's what the start does. There are no positional arguments before that. Or maybe you'd have 1 or 2. Maybe you'd have, you know, one of the main ones, and then everything else is going to be, you know, keyword only arguments, and you might do something like that. So kind of depends. But anyway, hopefully this gives you now a good feel for how the parameters and the arguments work with Python functions. And really, you should play around with this. Just try out different definitions, you know, try calling it in different ways, see how it works. That's going to be the best way for you to, you know, really understand and really kind of, you know, follow along with functions and their parameters and their arguments. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.